They said she was old enough to handle things on her own, that she was strong, independent, already built a life. So when the paperwork started changing, when decisions were made without her, and when her voice slowly disappeared from the room, no one called it abuse. They called it letting her grow up. But here's the question. No one wanted to ask, who decides when a grown woman no longer deserves protection? Stay with me, because what was written down quietly would later speak louder than anyone in that family ever did. And if this story resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps more people hear stories like this. The farm sat just outside town, where the road turned to dust and the cell signal faded without warning. It wasn't big, just a few dry acres, a weather-beaten house, and a windmill that groaned every afternoon like it was tired of standing. That place had been my father's whole life. And for a long time, it was mine too. I'm Emily Carter. I was 34 then. I had my own apartment 2 hours away, my own job, my own bills. That fact mattered more to everyone else than it ever did to me. People in town liked to say I'd made it out, like the farm was something to escape from, like leaving meant I no longer belonged to what was left behind. After my dad's health started failing, I came back more often, weekends at first, then full weeks. Then stretches of time where I couldn't remember which city my toothbrush was in. That's when the comments started. She's got her own life. She's strong. She can handle things. They said it casually, like they were complimenting me. My stepmother said it the most, usually with a smile, usually when decisions were already made. Jason, my stepbrother, didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. He just acted like I was a guest in a house I'd grown up in. He handled the paperwork. He talked to the utility companies. He sat at the kitchen table with contracts spread out while I stood at the sink, pretending to read mail I'd already opened. No one told me to leave. They didn't have to. They just kept reminding me I didn't need to stay. At night, I slept in my old room, the dresser drawer still stuck on the left side. The closet still smelled faintly like dust and cedar. I lay awake listening to the wind hit the windows, thinking about how strange it was to feel so temporary in a place that had once defined me. That's when I started noticing the label they'd put on me. Independent, capable, grown. It sounded like praise, but it worked like permission. Permission to exclude me from conversations. Permission to move forward without checking. Permission to decide what was best and call it care. When you're seen as independent, people assume you'll speak up if something's wrong. They assume silence means consent. What they don't see is how exhaustion changes the way you think. Grief doesn't make you dramatic, it makes you quiet. I was tired in ways sleep didn't fix. I was juggling my job, the drive back and forth, my dad's appointments, and the slow, creeping fear that something was slipping away from me. Not all at once, just enough that I couldn't grab it. When Jason took over managing the land, no one questioned it. He lived closer. He had experience. He sounded confident. And I didn't want to be the difficult one, the daughter who swooped in from the city and made things harder. So I nodded. I listened. I told myself I was being reasonable. That's the part no one warns you about. Sometimes independence isn't freedom. It's the story people tell themselves so they don't have to show up. I wasn't choosing to step back. I was being gently pushed, one polite decision at a time. No shouting, no fights. Just the quiet assumption that I'd be fine. And if you're watching this and thinking, I would have spoken up, I understand that. I thought the same thing. But when you're standing in a familiar kitchen, watching people you're supposed to trust make choices without you, it doesn't feel like a moment to fight. It feels like a moment to survive. I didn't know then that the farm wasn't just changing hands. I didn't know what had already been set in motion. I only knew this. Everyone agreed I was strong enough to be left out. At first, it didn't look like control. It looked like help. My dad needed oxygen more often. The tank showed up one afternoon without anyone asking me. Jason said he'd taken care of it. He said it like he was doing me a favor. The delivery guy didn't ask for my name. He didn't ask if I agreed. Jason signed the clipboard and leaned it against the counter like it belonged there. I told myself it made sense. Jason lived closer. He had more time. I was still driving back and forth, still trying to keep my job from falling apart. That's how it started. With things that were hard to argue against. When my dad had a bad night, Jason was already there. When bills came in, Jason said he'd handle them. When paperwork showed up from the county, my stepmother slid it into a folder I wasn't carrying. They never told me I wasn't allowed to help. They just stopped asking. One morning, I noticed the oxygen settings had been changed. I asked who adjusted them. Jason said the supplier told him it was better that way. I didn't know if that was true. I didn't know enough to argue. So I let it go. Later that week, I found a stack of documents on the kitchen table. Land surveys, zoning notices, something about an energy company. I asked what it was. Jason said it was nothing urgent, just preliminary conversations. He said my dad didn't need to worry about it, and neither did I. That word again. Worry. Care started coming with conditions. If I asked too many questions, I was stressing Dad out. If I wanted a second opinion, I was making things complicated. Every concern I raised came back to me as a flaw. Too emotional, too tired, too close to the situation. I stopped recognizing my own voice in the room. One afternoon, I came home to find a new lock on the filing cabinet, the one where my dad kept his records. Jason said it was for safety. I asked for a key. He said he'd get me one later. Later never came. I started writing things down. Not because I thought I needed proof, but because I couldn't trust my memory anymore. Dates? Conversations? Who said what? I felt silly doing it, like I was being paranoid. But every time I didn't write something down, it slipped away. And when I asked about it later, I was told it never happened. The fridge was often empty when I came back from work. Jason said he'd already taken care of dinner. Sometimes that meant takeout I never saw. My dad apologized to me more than he should have, for being a burden, for needing help. That was the part that hurt the most. Care isn't supposed to make someone feel smaller, but this did. One night, I overheard Jason on the phone. He was standing outside, pacing near the porch. He was talking numbers, a timeline. He said, "Once it's finalized, she won't have a say anyway." I didn't know who she was supposed to be, but my stomach dropped. When I asked him about it, he smiled. He said I must have misheard. He said I was overtired. That word again. I wanted to believe him, because believing him was easier than admitting something was wrong. If you've ever been in this position, you know how it goes. Nothing bad enough to point at, nothing dramatic, just a slow narrowing of space. I still lived in the house, but I didn't decide anything. I still helped my dad, but I didn't know what he was signing. I was present. But I wasn't included. The contracts arrived in a plain envelope. No explanation, just places to initial. Jason said it was standard. He said everyone had already agreed. I asked who everyone was. He didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "You trust us." Right. That question stayed with me longer than it should have. Trust shouldn't feel like pressure, and care shouldn't require silence. I didn't refuse to sign. Not yet. I said I needed time. Jason nodded, but his jaw tightened. That was the first crack. The help didn't stop, but it changed. The oxygen deliveries came earlier than scheduled. The paperwork moved faster. Meetings happened when I wasn't home. I felt alone in a house full of people. Every step was small, every decision justified, and taken together. They formed something else entirely. By the time I realized how much control I'd lost, I couldn't tell when it had been taken. I just knew this care had become something you had to earn. People asked me later why I didn't stop it sooner, why I didn't push back the moment things felt wrong, why I didn't raise my voice, demand answers, call someone. Those questions sound reasonable from the outside. But when you're standing inside the moment, your brain doesn't work the same way. Grief doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in your body. It makes simple decisions feel heavy. I woke up tired no matter how long I slept. I forgot things I'd just been told. I stared at the same email for 10 minutes and still didn't know how to answer it. People assume silence means agreement. Sometimes it just means you're trying to keep yourself together. Every time I thought about confronting Jason, my mind ran ahead of me. What if I made things worse for my dad? What if I said the wrong thing and lost access completely? I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth was simpler. I didn't feel strong enough to survive another loss. When you're already carrying grief, you don't rush toward conflict. You avoid it. You conserve what little energy you have left. And there's something else people don't talk about. When control builds slowly, it doesn't feel like danger. It feels like confusion. One day you're included. The next day, you're not. And you keep telling yourself you must have missed something. I replayed conversations in my head at night. Wondered if I was imagining the tension. Wondered if I was being unfair. That doubt is exhausting. Jason never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He sounded calm, confident. People trust calm voices. Meanwhile, I felt scattered, emotional, uncertain. So when I spoke, my words didn't land the same way. If you've never been in that position, it's easy to think you'd act differently. I thought the same thing once, but when you're tired, grieving, and alone, standing up for yourself feels like climbing a wall with no grip. I wasn't choosing weakness, I was choosing stability. Or at least, what looked like stability at the time. There were days I opened my notebook and didn't write anything. Not because nothing happened, but because I didn't have the energy to make sense of it. I told myself I'd deal with it later, after things settled, after my dad got better. That's another trap. You keep waiting for the moment when you'll feel ready, and that moment keeps moving. People who ask why victims don't react sooner are asking the wrong question. The real question is, what does constant pressure do to someone's ability to respond? By the time I realized how far things had gone, I wasn't calm anymore. I wasn't rested. I was surviving day to day. And survival mode doesn't plan confrontations. It just keeps you breathing. If you're watching this and thinking, I would never let that happen. I hope you're right. I truly do. But if you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, if you've ever delayed a hard conversation because you were already overwhelmed, then you understand more than you think. I didn't fight back because I trusted them. I didn't fight back because I was scared. I didn't fight back because I was tired of losing things. And I didn't know yet that waiting would have consequences. I realized the second betrayal on a Tuesday morning. Nothing dramatic, just an envelope that didn't have my name on it. It was addressed to my dad, but it had been opened already. I recognized Jason's handwriting on the corner, just a small note to himself. Inside were maps, not the kind you hang on a wall, the kind with boundaries, numbers, and fine print. I didn't understand all of it at first, but I recognized the logo. The same energy company everyone in town had been talking about for months. They wanted land, a lot of it. At the diner, people whispered about buyouts, about neighbors getting offers they didn't know how to evaluate, about contracts written in a language that didn't sound like English. I'd assumed our farm was just one of many. I was wrong. When I asked Jason about the envelope, he didn't look surprised. He looked annoyed. He said it wasn't my concern. He said the company had already approached him. He said it was an opportunity. That word again. Opportunity. I asked where my dad fit into all of this. Jason said Dad didn't need to worry about details anymore. I asked where I fit. Jason paused, just long enough to feel intentional. He said, "You don't live here full time." That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just about family. This was about positioning. The next few days, I paid closer attention. I listened instead of speaking. I noticed how Jason talked differently on the phone, how he used words like leverage and timeline, how he mentioned parcels instead of homes. Our farm wasn't a memory to him. It was a coordinate. I drove into town and talked to Mrs. Alvarez from down the road. She'd lived there longer than anyone. She said a man in a suit had come by with papers she didn't sign. She asked if we were selling too. I told her I didn't know. That answer stayed with me. I started seeing the pattern. Jason wasn't just managing my dad's care. He was managing information. Meetings happened while I was at work. Calls were returned when I wasn't home. Decisions were framed as already settled by the time I heard about them. And the worst part was how reasonable it all sounded. The company promised jobs, infrastructure, tax revenue for the town. Who argues with that? But when I asked to see the full contract, Jason said it wasn't finalized. When I asked who the land would be leased from, he said it was complicated. When I asked if my dad had signed anything, he said I was overthinking. I started checking the filing cabinet more often, still locked. The notebook became heavier in my pocket. Not physically, mentally. Every entry felt like proof I didn't want to need. One afternoon, I came home early and heard voices in the kitchen. Jason, and someone I didn't recognize. They stopped talking when they saw me. The stranger smiled too quickly. He said he was just consulting. I asked about what. He said, future development. Jason laughed it off. Said I caught them mid-conversation. After the man left, I asked Jason why I wasn't included. He said it wasn't personal. That was the second betrayal. The first was family choosing control over honesty. The second was realizing they'd invited outsiders into that control. This wasn't just about what I'd lose. It was about what everyone else would lose too. The farm sat between 3 other properties. If it went, the rest would follow. I saw it clearly then. Jason wasn't protecting my dad. He was positioning himself. And the company didn't care about family at all. They cared about silence. About signatures given by people too tired to ask questions. About daughters labeled independent so no one had to explain anything to them. I stood in the yard that evening, watching the sun drop behind the windmill. I'd grown up counting sunsets there. Never once had I thought about ownership. Now everything had a price tag. I felt alone in a way I hadn't before. Not because no one was around, but because the people closest to me had already chosen a side. I didn't confront Jason that night. I didn't call the company. I went back inside and opened my notebook. This time, I didn't hesitate. Dates, names, what I'd heard, what I'd seen. Because whatever was happening wasn't just private anymore. It had consequences beyond our family, and I didn't know yet how I'd stop it. I only knew this. The betrayal wasn't finished. I found the hard drive on a night when the house felt heavier than usual. My dad had gone to bed early. Jason was out. The silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt unfinished. I was looking for an old charger in the hallway closet, the kind of search you do just to stay busy. That's when I noticed the loose panel near the floor. I'd walked past it my whole life, never once questioned it. Behind it was a small metal box, locked, but not carefully. Inside was the hard drive. No label, just a strip of faded tape. I didn't plug it in right away. I stood there longer than I should have, holding it in my hands, trying to decide what I was allowed to know. Eventually, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the same table where decisions had been made without me. The first folder was dated years back, before my dad got sick. Before Jason moved closer, there were scanned documents, emails, spreadsheets with notes in my dad's handwriting. I recognized his way of organizing things, careful, methodical. This wasn't panic. This was preparation. I kept scrolling. There were emails from the energy company, early ones. Before anyone in town knew their name, they weren't addressed to Jason. They were addressed to my dad. He'd asked questions, lots of them, about land access, about long-term leases, about what happened when neighboring properties refused to sell. There were replies that stopped being polite over time. I saw meeting notes, dates and times I remembered my dad being too tired to see visitors. There were audio files too, short recordings, conversations he'd captured on his phone, not secretly, just quietly. You could hear chairs scraping, coffee cups being set down, and voices. Jason's voice was there, calm, confident, talking about timelines. Another voice I didn't recognize talked about pressure points, about which families would come around eventually. They talked about our farm like it was a gap in a puzzle. I paused the recording and closed my laptop. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from recognition. My dad had known, not everything, but enough. He'd known the land mattered more than they were saying. He'd known silence was being used as leverage, and he'd known I was being kept out on purpose. The next folder was labeled simply "in case." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just evidence for me. This was insurance for everyone. There were property maps showing how one sale triggered another. Notes about how losing our land would isolate the next family over. There was a list of names, people I grew up with, people who trusted my dad. He wasn't just protecting his house. He was protecting the space between houses. I remembered how often he'd told me to write things down, to keep records, to never rely on memory when money was involved. At the time, I thought he was being old-fashioned. Now I understood. He hadn't confronted Jason. He hadn't called anyone out. He'd stayed quiet, and he'd been watching. There was one video near the end, dated just weeks before his health declined. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one I was sitting at now. He looked tired, but steady. He didn't talk about betrayal. He talked about consequences. He said if I was watching this, it meant things had gone further than he hoped. He said people count on exhaustion, on family ties being too heavy to cut through. He said the truth only mattered if it survived the moment. I watched that video twice. When I closed the laptop, the house felt different, not safer, clearer. I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't been weak. I'd been early. The next morning, I noticed Jason watching me more closely, as if he could sense the shift. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I wasn't alone anymore. Not really. I had dates, names, recordings. I had evidence. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood my father differently. He hadn't failed to protect me. He'd chosen a kind of protection that didn't make noise. one that waited, one that assumed I would be strong enough to finish what he started. The weight of that settled in slowly, not as comfort, as responsibility. I closed the hard drive back into its case and slid it into my bag. I didn't know yet how I'd use it, or who I'd show it to first. I only knew this: the truth had been written down, and that meant it could no longer be erased. After I found the hard drive, I couldn't stop asking myself one question. Why didn't he say something sooner? Why didn't my dad warn me? Why didn't he confront Jason? Why didn't he shut it all down the moment it started? That question followed me everywhere. I asked it while making coffee, while driving into town, while sitting at his bedside, listening to his breathing slow and uneven. From the outside, silence looks like weakness. It always does. But when you live inside it, silence feels like calculation. I replayed the recordings again, this time listening for what wasn't said. The pauses, the way my dad redirected conversations, the moments where he stopped short of pushing back. He wasn't unaware. He was careful, and that realization didn't bring comfort. It brought conflict. Because if he knew, then he chose to wait. And waiting has consequences. I imagined a different version of events. What if he had told me everything the first time the energy company reached out? What if he had confronted Jason early, before contracts, before leverage? Would things have been easier, or would they have exploded faster? I thought about the power dynamics. An older man with declining health, a daughter already labeled independent, a company with lawyers and timelines. Who would they have believed if my dad had spoken up too soon? He would have been painted as paranoid, difficult, uncooperative, and I would have been painted as emotional, biased, too close to the situation. I'd seen that playbook before. People who challenge quiet deals are rarely thanked. They're isolated. And isolation was already closing in. There's something people don't understand about endurance. Endurance isn't passive, it's strategic. My dad didn't raise his voice because he knew volume wasn't power. Documentation was. He didn't accuse because accusations disappear. Records don't. But knowing that didn't make it easier to accept. I still wondered what it cost him to hold all of that alone. How many nights he lay awake listening to plans form around him. How many times he chose not to intervene because intervening would have exposed me sooner. There's a kind of protection that looks like distance. At the time, I thought he was pulling away. Now I see he was making space, for evidence, for timing, and still. I asked myself, if you were me, would you forgive that? Would you accept that kind of silence as love? I don't have a clean answer. I only know this. If he had spoken early, he would have been dismissed. If he had fought openly, he would have been outmatched. By waiting, he gave me something else. Options. The truth didn't arrive gently. It arrived heavy, with files, with timestamps, with consequences already mapped out. That was his choice, not to save himself, but to make sure that when the truth surfaced, it couldn't be buried again. People like to say suffering is never justified, and they're right. But sometimes the choice isn't between pain and safety. It's between quiet pain now, or irreversible damage later. My dad didn't choose silence because he was afraid. He chose it because he understood the terrain. He knew who had power. He knew how quickly that power could turn against the wrong person. And he knew I would need more than words. I would need proof. So was it a mistake? If you're asking whether it hurt, yes, it did. If you're asking whether it protected me, also yes. Both things can be true. That's the part people struggle with. We want heroes who act loudly and immediately. But real life doesn't always reward that. Sometimes the bravest thing someone can do is endure long enough to leave a record behind. And sometimes, love looks like restraint. I didn't come to peace with his choice right away. I'm not sure I ever fully will. But I stopped calling it weakness. I started calling it strategy, because when the moment finally came to act, we weren't empty-handed. We weren't guessing. We weren't alone. And whatever judgment comes after that, that's something I can live with. Justice didn't arrive the way I had imagined it in my head. There were no arguments in the driveway. No shouting matches that finally exposed everything. No moment where someone admitted they were wrong. It came quietly, almost politely. It started with a meeting that didn't feel important at the time. A small office near the courthouse, faded paint, a desk with scratches from years of elbows leaning too hard. I sat down across from a lawyer who didn't know my family, didn't know our history, didn't care who was supposed to be trusted. That helped. I placed the hard drive on the table, then my notebook. I didn't add anything else. I didn't explain how tired I was, or how long it had taken me to understand what was happening. I just said, "This is what I have." He asked me to start at the beginning, so I did, slowly, carefully. When I finished, he didn't rush to give advice. He didn't tell me what should have happened. He asked one question. "Is any of this recorded anywhere else?" I told him yes. Backups, copies. He nodded once. That was it. From that moment on, the story stopped being emotional. It became procedural. Requests were filed. Emails were subpoenaed. Signatures were compared. Dates were lined up next to each other. Jason didn't know any of this yet. The energy company didn't either. They were still operating under the assumption that silence meant compliance, that exhaustion meant surrender. They were wrong. The first sign of change wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Jason stopped making phone calls in the house. He stepped outside more often, closed the door behind him. He started asking questions instead of giving instructions. I answered fewer of them. A few days later, I noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked near the edge of the property. County tags. Clipboards tucked under arms. No one knocked. No one announced themselves. They didn't need to. They were there to verify, not to accuse. That distinction mattered. Neighbors were interviewed, not aggressively, just methodically. People were asked when they'd first been contacted, who they'd spoken to, what they'd been promised. Some of them were surprised, others weren't. Information that had been scattered across private conversations suddenly had a place to land. The energy company sent a representative, then another. Each time, they stayed a little shorter, smiled a little less. Their language changed. Opportunity became review. Timeline became pending. Jason tried to regain control. He offered to take care of it, to smooth things over. I said no. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain why. I just said no. That was enough. When the police came, they didn't come like people expect. No sirens, no neighbors watching from their windows. They came with questions. They asked about access, about authorization, about who had signed what, and when. They didn't accuse. They listened. I played the recordings. I watched their expressions change, not to shock, but to focus. One officer paused the audio and looked at Jason. He asked, "Is that you?" Jason didn't answer right away. That silence said more than any denial could have. After that, things moved faster. Accounts were frozen. Documents were flagged. Communication shifted from phone calls to letters. Jason stopped staying at the house. The energy company withdrew its proposal. No announcement, just a statement about revised plans. In town, people noticed. Conversations changed tone. Less excitement, more caution. Deals that once felt inevitable were suddenly questioned. That mattered. My dad watched all of this from his chair by the window. He didn't comment. He didn't need to. He had already said what needed to be said years earlier by writing it down. The consequences unfolded without anyone needing to push them. Locks were changed. Permissions were revoked. Access was limited. Jason packed quietly. There was no apology, no confrontation. Just boxes being carried out. One by one, I thought I would feel relief or satisfaction. I didn't. What I felt was stability. For the first time in a long time, decisions weren't being made around me. They were being made with evidence. The town didn't celebrate. It adjusted. Projects were paused. Meetings were rescheduled. People started asking better questions before signing anything. That was justice too. One afternoon, I stood alone in the kitchen, the same kitchen where plans had been discussed without me. I realized something else had changed. I wasn't afraid to speak anymore, not because I wanted conflict, but because I knew my words wouldn't be dismissed. When truth is documented, it doesn't need volume. It just needs time. My dad asked me later if it was finished. I told him it was quiet now. He understood what that meant. Justice doesn't always arrive with closure. Sometimes it arrives with boundaries, with systems doing what they're supposed to do once they're given the truth, with people learning they can't move through other people's lives unnoticed. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. The farm stayed. The town stayed. And the silence that followed wasn't the kind that hides damage. It was the kind that comes after the truth has already done its work. No shouting, no spectacle, just evidence, and the consequences that follow when it's finally heard. After everything that happened, people kept asking me how I didn't see it sooner, how I missed the signs, how I didn't know something was wrong. The truth is, most financial abuse doesn't look like theft. It looks like help. So I want to step out of my story for a moment, because if this could happen in my family, it can happen in yours. There are 3 signs I wish I had recognized earlier. The first sign is when access slowly disappears. No one says you're not allowed to know. They just stop including you. Bills get paid without explanation. Documents get filed without your signature. Decisions get made while you're not in the room. If you ask questions, you're told it's already handled, that it's complicated, that you don't need to worry. That's not care. That's control. If you're ever told that information is being withheld for your own good, pause. Because adults who are trusted don't need to be protected from facts. The second sign is urgency paired with reassurance. You're told something needs to be signed quickly. That delays will cause problems. That everyone else has already agreed. At the same time, you're reassured that it's no big deal. If it's not a big deal, it can wait. If it can't wait, it deserves scrutiny. Pressure and comfort shouldn't come in the same sentence. That combination is designed to shut down questions. The third sign is when your emotions are used to discredit your judgment. You're told you're too stressed, too tired, too emotional to understand what's happening. Your concerns aren't addressed. They're reframed as symptoms. That's one of the most effective tools there is. Because once you start doubting your own clarity, someone else gets to decide for you. I was grieving. I was exhausted. And instead of that being a reason to protect me, it became a reason to bypass me. If you've ever been told to wait until you're in a better headspace before being included in financial decisions, that's a red flag. Hard moments are when transparency matters most. Here's the part no one tells you. Financial abuse doesn't require cruelty. It doesn't require raised voices or threats. It only requires silence, time, and access. And it often comes from people who insist they're helping. If you're watching this and something feels familiar, trust that feeling. Start small. Write things down. Ask for copies. Request explanations in writing. You don't need to accuse anyone. You don't need to start a fight. You just need to create a record, because records change dynamics. They slow things down. They force clarity. And clarity protects you in ways emotion can't. I didn't understand this until it was almost too late. I thought trust meant letting go. I thought independence meant staying quiet. I was wrong. Real independence means knowing what's happening in your name. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. If access is shrinking, ask why. If urgency is rising, slow down. If your emotions are being used against you, document everything. You're not being difficult. You're being careful. And careful is how you protect yourself before consequences are forced on you. I learned that late. You don't have to. People kept telling me I was strong, that I'd handled things well, that I was independent, that I didn't need anyone anymore. They meant it as a compliment. But strength isn't the same as safety, and independence isn't the same as protection. Somewhere along the way, we started treating adulthood like a finish line. Like once you cross it, you're no longer allowed to need help, no longer allowed to ask questions, no longer allowed to be protected. I believed that too, for a long time. I thought being capable meant staying quiet, that handling things on my own meant not involving anyone else, that asking for clarity made me look weak. It doesn't. What I learned is this: no one ever becomes too grown to be taken advantage of. They just become easier to dismiss. When people say, "You're old enough to handle it," sometimes what they really mean is, "I don't want to be responsible." That realization didn't come all at once. It settled in slowly. I saw it in the way decisions were made without me, in the way concern disappeared the moment I asked for details, in how silence was mistaken for consent. Being an adult didn't protect me from that. It made it easier to justify. I don't tell this story to make anyone feel afraid. I tell it because fear thrives in the absence of information. Protection doesn't end when childhood does. It just changes shape. As adults, protection looks like transparency, like access, like documentation. It looks like knowing what's being decided in your name. If there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this: you don't owe anyone your silence to prove you're strong. You don't have to stay quiet to be considered mature. You don't have to endure confusion to be seen as capable. Real strength is asking for clarity before consequences appear. If something feels off, pause. If information is being withheld, ask why. If you're being told to trust without being shown, take notes. Write things down. Save emails. Keep copies. Not because you expect the worst, but because you deserve to know what's happening. I used to think evidence was something you gathered only when things went wrong. Now I know it's something you keep so they don't. There's a difference. You don't need to accuse anyone. You don't need to start a fight. You just need to stay informed. No one is ever too grown to need protection, and no one should be made to feel ashamed for asking for it. If my story made you think of someone you care about, check in on them. If it made you think of yourself, trust that instinct. Keep the truth close. Keep the records. Keep the facts. And if you're watching this and you've ever been told you're strong enough to handle being left out, remember this: strength doesn't mean standing alone. It means making sure you're not standing in the dark. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the most important protection we have is knowing we're not alone.